Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on the final webinar of CIPP's National Payroll Week 2025 celebrations. I'm Matthew Akrigg. I'm the Policy and Research Officer here at the CIPP. Today, we're going to be exploring some statutory maternity pay with our speaker, Training Manager Fiona Smith from IPP Education. Please do put questions in the Q&A tab and chat within the chat function. It's all about collaboration and education during National Payroll Week, so please do get involved there. Thank you very much for bearing with us. We were just having some last minute issues getting the slides sorted, but I'm glad to say we're all sorted now, and I will hand over to Fiona to introduce herself, and I'll pop back in at the end for questions. Take it away, Fiona.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Matt. And I hope everyone has had a fantastic National Payroll Week so far. It has been so brilliant seeing all of the different posts and all of the different ways that we are celebrating the payroll profession. So what better way to cap off your National Payroll Week than with a little taster of payroll education? So as Matt mentioned, I'm Fiona Smith. I am the training manager at IPP Education. So I'm responsible for all of our training courses, and for my sins, my background is in operational payroll. So I used to operate various different payrolls and have plenty of experience with the lovely intricacies of making sure that those individuals that go off work with pregnancies, with maternity, making sure that they are paid accurately and compliantly, because it's not one of these topics that we come across all the time. It can mean that we get a little bit rusty on those skills. So hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, we will take a look at this key employee benefit and make sure that you understand how to administer this type of payment. As Matt mentioned, there's going to be some interaction today. So even though it is a Friday afternoon, I'm going to be expecting you to chat to me, put some questions in the Q&A. This is meant to be a bit of a taster of how our training works at IPP Education. So the more that you ask, the more the interactions you get, the better this session will be for you. So please feel free to pose as many questions as you like. Matt just won't ask me the really difficult ones. I'm kidding. I will try and answer as many as I can. So let's look at what we are going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, statutory maternity pay is one of those elements of payroll that we all have to deal with on payrolls at some point. And it involves your employees being absent from work and having the right to be absent from work and still return to their same job, but also where employees meet certain criteria, the eligibility, testing their eligibility for pay. So we're going to do a quick overview of what SMP is and how it works. We're then going to dive into those tests to work out whether an employee qualifies for a minimum payment from their employer or not. Then we're going to have a look at how we work out the rate of pay and a person's average weekly earnings. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. So we're going to identify what's called a relevant period for testing somebody's earnings. So seeing how much they've earned and working out how much we have to pay them for SMP. We'll cap off the kind of educational bit, looking at some of the questions and complications around actually paying your employee their SMP, how you calculate the rates, how you actually administer the payment. And we're going to have some time for questions. We're actually going to move that right to the end of today's session, as it's the very last session in National Payroll Week. So before the questions, I'm going to give you a little quick quiz, because you didn't think you'd be able to just sit there and absorb all this information. The best way to actually test your knowledge is to put it into action. So we're going to have a little quick quiz, and hopefully we'll get you getting the right answers. So looking at maternity pay, as I mentioned, this is a minimum payment that employers must make to employees that meet the eligibility criteria. So your organisation may actually choose to pay more than statutory maternity pay. So they may choose to enhance that payment, but they can never pay less than statutory maternity pay for those that qualify. It doesn't mean that the employer has to fit the whole bill, because effectively what we are doing is we are paying individuals that would otherwise qualify for benefits directly from the government. We're paying them through the payroll instead. So employers that do pay statutory maternity pay can reclaim a portion of that from the government to kind of offset the costs. You can only ever offset the correct amount of statutory maternity pay. So it's important to note, if your organisation does choose to enhance the maternity pay for employees, you need to still calculate statutory maternity pay, the amount that's due, because that is the value, or the portion of that value, that you'll be able to recover from HMRC. Most organisations can recover 92% of any SMP paid within a period. But small employers, which are defined as those whose NI bill was less than £45,000 the year before, can actually claim not only 100% of the payment, but an additional 8.5% of that payment, because of to offset the costs of administering the type of payment for those very small employers. So they can claim 108.5%. With SMP, one of the actually quite good mechanics in how it works is that we base whether somebody qualifies for maternity pay in the first place and how much they'll be paid when they take their leave on fixed dates. And that's because notoriously babies do not come when they are supposed to. So your doctor may, or a person's doctor will calculate when the baby is due to come, so the due date, but actually babies will come early, babies will come late, and it would be a nightmare if we had to recalculate the rate of pay and re-establish eligibility dependent on when the baby actually arrives. So what we'll do to work out whether someone's eligible and calculate that rate is identify what's called as the week the baby's due. And this is a statutory week, which always begins on a Sunday and ends on a Saturday, that contains that due date that the doctor or midwife has identified. So as soon as you know the due date, you'll be able to work out that week the baby's due. And then because that is now a fixed week, we can then apply various different tests by working out whether your employee has the right length of service and how much they have earned based on that date only, and it will never change. So once you've identified that week the baby's due, then you'll not need to recalculate SMP later on. So it provides certainty on the employee's part, because they know when they can take their leave, and on the employer's part as well, because they know you've got these fixed dates that have been worked out. The next most important fixed date is what we call the qualifying week. And this is a week 15 weeks before the baby is due. And it will actually be the point at which we do all of the tests to work out whether someone qualifies for maternity or not. So you'll count back 15 weeks from the week the baby is due. And in that week, the employee has to meet the various eligibility tests. We also have to do a couple of other things in the qualifying week as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's worth mentioning, before we start looking at all of the eligibility tests that we'll do in that qualifying week, is that there are some reasons why someone might be excluded from receiving maternity leave and pay in the first place. Now, these can range from not having the length of service, so being newly employed, through to not earning enough, through to even individuals who are detained by the government in custody. Sorry, I lost the word. So individuals who are in custody don't qualify for maternity pay. So there's quite a good set of guidance on hmrc.gov.uk around the exclusions, and any time that someone is excluded from receiving a type of statutory pay, you have to issue them with a non-payment form. This form is called the SMP1. And on that form is a set of tick boxes that will tell you all the reasons for excluding somebody from maternity. So yeah, make sure you do check out that form because it's really useful, and you must issue it to individuals if they don't qualify. So speaking of qualifying, as I mentioned, we have to identify the week the baby's due and then the qualifying week based on that. The qualifying week, 15 weeks before the baby will come, will be the week in which they have to satisfy 2 different tests to qualify for maternity pay. Now, maternity leave is a day 1 right for any pregnant employees. So they are entitled to 52 weeks of leave, and they will get that automatically, and their job will be protected within that period. The qualifying week is only really to test eligibility for pay. So whether the employer has to make a payment to them instead of the individual applying for maternity allowance directly from the DWP. So the 2 tests that we have to perform in that week is the employment service test, which is to work out whether your employee has been working for you continuously for 26 weeks before that qualifying week. If they haven't been working for 26 weeks, unfortunately, they won't qualify for maternity pay from their employer. But as I mentioned, they can go and apply for maternity allowance, which, if they have the correct NI records, tends to be a fairly equivalent amount without the first few weeks of enhanced pay. Now, we could go and count back 26 weeks from that qualifying week, or the CIPP publishes pay tables each year, which do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Because what they will do is take that week the baby is due, and in the different columns next to it will identify all of the relevant dates that you need to be aware of for somebody's maternity leave. So in the first column in that table, there is the qualifying week identified for you. So you don't have to count back 15 weeks. It's right there. And in the third column, there is actually the date that is 26 weeks before the beginning of that qualifying week. So as long as your employee was employed on that date and has continued to be employed with you since that date, then they will meet that employment services test of 26 weeks continuous employment. If they've had a break in service of more than a week, or they started later than that date, then unfortunately they won't meet that test, and you will have to issue the SMP1 form, the non-payment form. The second test that we have to do is slightly more involved. Now, for these purposes, we have to identify whether the employee earns above the lower earnings limit. So it's the lower earnings limit that's in effect on the last day of that qualifying week. So sometimes, if you think about it, if it's there are those people, aren't there, that don't know that they're pregnant and have a surprise baby. And in those cases, you can actually be looking backwards in time. So you would be looking 15 weeks back and looking at what the lower earnings limit was at that point. But mostly you're looking at this year's lower earnings limit. Now, your average weekly earnings have to be calculated even if you pay your employee on a different schedule. So the majority of employees in the UK are paid monthly. We still have to compare a week's earnings against the lower earnings limit for the purposes of working out if they meet this test. Now, for some employees who are earning, £20,000 per year, plucking that figure out of my head and I hope it's okay, it's very clear that they are earning more than the lower earnings limit on average. So you may not need to do the average earnings test for every single employee. However, you will have to work out average weekly earnings for every employee because it serves another purpose when we talk about maternity leave, because one of the rates of pay is going to be based on these average earnings. So I'm going to take you through in a minute how to do this calculation and how we work out which payments are included in this average calculation. But before I do, It's worth pointing out that, as I mentioned, the qualifying week also has another job because it's the last point at which your employee is supposed to give you notice that they're pregnant. So 15 weeks before the baby is due, by the end of that qualifying week, if your employee hasn't given you notice, and there isn't a good reason why they haven't given you notice, so again, see my example with someone who didn't know they were pregnant, they couldn't reasonably have given you notice, but if they just haven't notified you and suddenly want to go on maternity leave, not giving you notice by the end of that qualifying week can be one of the reasons for refusing to pay statutory maternity pay. And again, the employee would have to then claim maternity allowance instead. The employer has flexibility here. So if you deem that there's a good reason why the employee gave you late notice, you can still pay maternity pay. You're not excluded from being able to do it, but it provides that protection again for the employer to know 15 weeks before the baby's due that this employee will be going on maternity leave and is requesting maternity pay. So let's talk about that average weekly earnings calculation. Now for our calculations, it's prescribed within the regulations and it's quite detailed as to how it's prescribed. What we have to do is identify what's known as a relevant period for maternity pay. And this is the period of 8 weeks before the end of the qualifying week. But it has to take into account the fact of different paydays and different earnings periods. So what we actually have to do in practice is identify 2 different dates. So the end of the relevant period, our date 1, is the last payday that fell before the end of the qualifying week. So in this example here, we've got a weekly paid employee who's paid every Friday. So their qualifying week ended on the 12th of April, 2026. So we go back and we look at when the last Friday was before them. With monthly paid employees, this can actually push you back quite far because you're looking at the last payday that fell before the end of that qualifying week. And if you're only paid once a month, that week, date 1, means that the 8 weeks you're actually looking at are quite far in the past. So once we've identified date 1, we are then going to identify date 2. And what that date is 8 weeks before our date 1. And then we look to the payday that falls outside of that 8-week period. And it's the day after that. So we exclude that payday that falls outside of our 8-week period, but it means that our relevant period for maternity pay calculations begins the day after that payday. Now, in practice, that just means that you're looking at generally the last 2 paydays that fell before the qualifying week for a monthly payroll. But the reason we have to be so prescriptive around identifying this relevant period for SMP is because of a ruling called the Alabaster ruling, which just means that if a pay rise is effective at any point from that date 2, the very beginning of this relevant period for SMP, all the way through until the employee returns from their maternity leave, then you have to do a recalculation of this average weekly earnings and potentially pay an extra amount of SMP for that employee. So we do need to know that full date 2, even though it just falls the day after the payday we're not going to include. So in this weekly example, we've got the 11th of April, which was our date 1, that is included. We've got 4th, the 28th, all the way back, 8 different paydays. All of those are included. And we've identified our date 2 as the day after the one that isn't included in our calculation. So that's your relevant period. Once you've identified your relevant period, you look at all the paydays that fall into that relevant period and add them all together. And that's your relevant pay in the relevant period. The pay that's included is any NI-able pay that's paid to an employee. So you are just looking at that top gross NI-able pay. Once you have that information for a weekly payroll, in fact, sorry, I'll skip back. For the weekly payroll, we're just going to add those 8 weeks together and divide by 8 to get an average week. That seems fairly straightforward. For a monthly payroll, we do something slightly different because there aren't always going to be 8 weeks of pay included within those months. So what we do instead is we add together the pay periods that fall into that relevant period. We then divide by the number of pay periods to get an average month. Then we multiply that average month by 12 to get an average year. And then we divide the average year by 52 to get an average week. So in this example, an employee who's paid on the last working day of each month with a qualifying week of 25th of May to the 31st of May. Our date 1 was going to be the 30th of May, the last payday that fell before the end of that qualifying week. And presumably we counted back and did the whole relevant period, and April's pay also falls into that relevant period. So our calculation over those 2 months, we add together the total pay in the relevant period, 3,300. We divide it by 2 because there was 2 paydays in that period to get an average month. We multiply by 12 for a year. We then divide by 52 for an average week. And that comes out to £380, 76.923 pence. And it might seem weird that we include fractions of a penny, but at this point we have to include those fractions of a penny because in statutory calculations, any fraction of a penny must be rounded up to the next whole penny. It's always going to work in your employee's favour. So when we do average pay calculations, we always include them up to 5 decimal places. So 76 pence and then an extra 3 decimal places before we truncate, we chop it off. So it doesn't matter if that 6th decimal place would have been a 9, we're only going to go up to that 5th decimal place. And that gives us our average weekly earnings, which you should hopefully see in payroll systems as an established number. Like I say, the 2 things that we're going to do with that average weekly earnings is use it for the average weekly earnings test. So is it above the lower earnings limit? That's £123. So far above, this employee would meet that test. And then the other thing we're going to do with it is calculate the earnings related rate, the first 6 weeks of maternity pay. So I said that you wouldn't be able to just sit here and absorb information. We've got a little exercise for you. So we've got a test. So our employee has a week the baby's due of the 8th of June 2025. What would her qualifying week be? So someone's going to have to get out either the tables or count back 15 weeks and let me know in the chat if you like what the qualifying week would be for that employee. It all goes quiet and everyone's like, no, I don't want to do homework. Victoria, lovely. Thank you very much. Coming straight in. Yes, we've got some thumbs up. Well done. Well done, team. Absolutely. So the week beginning the 23rd of February, if you got that, that is the correct answer. Her qualifying week then finishes on the 1st of March. So looking at her payments, considering she gets paid on the 23rd of each month, which payments are we going to use for her average earnings? So we've got February, we've got January, and we've got December. So remember, our relevant period begins on the first payday that fell before the end of that qualifying week. So 1st of March, our date 1 is going to be hopefully the 23rd of February. And then within 8 weeks, we're not going to get to December. So that means that our relevant period is going to begin on the 24th of December and run to the 23rd of February, including absolutely well done. February and January's paydays. So those are our two that we're going to use for average weekly earnings. And if you want to play along, I'm not going to make you. You could calculate the average weekly earnings by adding them together, divide them by 2, times by 12, divide by 52. If you're very quick, I'm going to click on the next slide though. Oh. And that's it. Yes, well done, Alice. You beat me to the punch, but it is the correct answer. January and February's, and we get an average weekly earnings of, if you can see that, it's very tiny, £369, 23.076 pence. Well done if you got that answer at home. So what do we do with this? We've got average weekly earnings. We've worked out the eligibility. So our employee, yes, has been employed with us for 26 weeks by that qualifying week. Yes, earned more than the lower earnings limit in that period. So they meet those two eligibility tests. Now we need to work out what SMP we're actually going to pay to them. So you get 52 weeks of maternity leave, but not all of those weeks will attract a payment. For SMP, you get paid for 39 weeks. The first 6 weeks are always going to be paid at what is called your earnings related rate. And that earnings related rate is based on your average weekly earnings that we've just identified. So that's why it's so important to calculate that accurately and to 5 decimal places, because your earnings related rate, a fixed rate of statutory pay, is going to be based on 90% of those average weekly earnings, with any fraction of a penny rounded up to the next whole pence. So if it's not on the slide, but I'm going to do it in a calculator. If we take the amount that we've just identified, 23.076 pence, and we work out 90% of that, we come to £332, 30.7684 pence. So you would end up with a rate of £332, 31 pence that must be paid. Well done, Anna. Yes, great. That must be paid for every single week. Well, sorry, for those first 6 weeks of maternity. And it's a whole pence rate because that is the fixed rate that must be paid for every whole week of maternity leave. Once that first 6 weeks have finished, then the employee is still entitled to 33 more weeks of pay, but the rate will be capped at the standard weekly rate. So this year's standard weekly rate is £187.18. So if your earnings related rate is higher than that amount, then your rate will drop. It will go down to the cap of £187.18, or however much it currently is in that week. If, however, your 90% was less than the cap, less than the standard weekly rate, you actually would remain on that weekly rate for the whole 39 weeks. So you just have to be careful of that, because the SMP rate has risen quite a lot, appropriately. So some employees, their 90% can end up being less than the weekly rate of maternity. So you must never put them up to the standard weekly rate. It's only ever a cap after 6 weeks. So it's the lower of the two. So now we've worked out what the rate of pay is. How do we actually get this payment to the employee, or when can they start their maternity leave? Now, generally, maternity pay will start the same day as maternity leave. So while we've been working out whether someone qualifies, we've had to look at it at whole weeks beginning on a Sunday, ending on a Saturday. With actually taking your leave, once you're eligible, the employee generally can nominate a day of the week that they want to start their leave. So in the writing, when they notify you of their requirement to take maternity leave, they'll generally nominate a day that they want to start. And that day can be within 11 weeks of the beginning of their week the baby's due. So you can see why the qualifying week is 15 weeks, because it gives a minimum of 4 weeks notice that employers will get, even if your employee wants to go on maternity leave as soon as they possibly can. So that's the first reason why maternity leave would be triggered, or the employee would start to go on leave, and then you would have to start paying them for maternity pay. And maternity pay will also only be paid in whole weeks, or rather any week in which an employee works, so they weren't off for a whole week, they don't qualify for a payment of maternity leave. So generally, maternity leave will be a whole 52 weeks or a whole 39 weeks or any other number of whole weeks. But it can begin, the whole weeks will run from the day that the employee begins their maternity leave, rather than always a Sunday to Saturday. There are two situations where maternity leave is automatically triggered, potentially earlier than the day that the employee nominates. And that is, firstly, if the baby is born early. So if the baby is born before the date that the employee nominates, then the day after the birth is the automatic beginning of their maternity leave. So even if they'd wanted to go later, your 39 weeks of pay begin from that day after the birth. The same triggering condition happens for pregnancy-related illness during a period that's called the exqualifying, that's not the word, disqualifying period. And that's a period of 4 weeks before the baby is due, where during that period, to protect the health of mother and baby, if the employee is absent from work for a whole day of pregnancy-related illness, the maternity leave will automatically trigger. So it won't count if the employee is off because they have a flu or a broken leg, but if they have something like preeclampsia or anything that's pregnancy related and they're off for a day, the day after that first day of illness, maternity leave begins and the maternity pay would start. And again, you can then figure out the whole weeks of pay from that point. For the basis of payment, because pay is only due for whole weeks of absence, the employer has two choices. If you're not already on a weekly schedule for an individual, then you can choose either to pay whole weeks. So most payroll systems that I've seen, there may be others, will calculate it based on the number of Saturdays in the month. So 1 month you'll have 4 weeks, the next month you'll have 5 weeks because you've got a partial week that's rolled over. As long as the employee receives the right amount of pay across the period that they're off, you can pay it in whole weeks like that. You do have the option to align statutory pay to your payroll period by dividing the weekly rate by 7 and then paying a partial week at the beginning of the month and a partial week at the end of the month, just to align it to a payroll period if you want to. But again, the employer must still receive the right amount of statutory pay, and any fraction of a penny of that partial week is rounded up. You're never going to accidentally pay your employee a penny less. That would be a crime. Not an actual crime, I clarify. So generally you'll come up with a payment schedule for an employee. So our employee earlier, who we worked out the average earnings and we worked out the rate of pay, £332.31. For weeks 1 to 6, they will receive that per week. For weeks 7 to 39, they will be entitled to £187.18 per week, and their total payment, if they take the full 39 weeks, will end up being just over £8,000 of SMP. Okay, as I said, we're going to do questions right at the end. So get them in now if you do have any questions, and we'll answer as many as we can. But before we do, I have some questions for you. So I'd like you all to pop in the chat. What is the current rate of SMP? Wonderful. We've got ticks across the board. You are correct. £187.18 is the answer. Anyone paying attention to the notice requirements for maternity? So what is the latest date an employee must give their employer notice of their intention to start maternity? Is it A, 4 weeks before the baby's due? Is it B, 26 weeks? Or is it C, 15 weeks before the baby's due? Wonderful. Knew I could rely on you again. We've got a chorus of 15 weeks, and that's correct. Under normal circumstances, they must have given you notice by the end of that qualifying week. You can, at your discretion, accept a shorter notice if there's a good reason for it, for the late notice. And my last one, a weekly paid employee earned £1,020 during their relevant period of 8 weeks, 8 payments. Do they qualify for SMP? Wonderful. Got lots of yeses. Absolutely. We got it. Or rather, being really picky, we know that they meet the earnings test. We'd have to check their employment service test as well. So thank you very much for paying attention, for joining in and talking to me during this session. We'll hopefully go over to Matt to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Before I jump into the questions, let me just explain what's on the slide here. We do have a promotion for National Payroll Week. So if you are not a member and considering joining us, use the code MPWMEM, MPWMEM, and that will give you 20% off your first year, plus the £50 admin fee will be waived. You can't get that online. You are going to have to email membership though. So if you are considering membership, email membership@cipp.org.uk, quote that code, and you can get some money off. The following years will be at the normal renewal price.
What an offer, Matt. Can I just butt in to say, if you are a member and you're considering doing a IPP education training course, you get money off the training course. So the membership almost pays for itself. That's a great deal.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you very much for today's session, Fiona. I am just having a quick chat with our events team because I can't see the Q&A tab. So if you do have any questions, you can also put them in the chat tab and I will be able to see them. Otherwise, I'm waiting for the screenshots of those questions from the Q&A tab to come through, or I don't know if you can see those, Fiona.
I can see them, Matt. Do you want me to ask my own questions?
You can ask your own questions.
Thank you for being here. Okay, I'll go down the list. I believe you can upvote questions as well. So if you spot a question you'd really like answered, please do upvote them. So I'll ask the question first I've got is Jay, who has asked, how would you work out SMP if pay had increased? So the alabaster rule I was talking about. So the alabaster rule came into effect because of an equality, pay equality suit that was brought by a pregnant employee whose company had awarded a pay increase, but because she was on maternity leave and on a statutory rate of pay, she didn't get the benefit of this pay increase. So what it means is we have to identify any pay increase that happened from that date to, so that is 8, sometimes even 10 or 12 weeks before the qualifying week, which was 15 weeks before the baby's due, all the way back then, all the way through to the end of your maternity leave period. So actually some employees, very lucky employees, can end up having 2 alabaster pay increases, 2 relevant pay increases. And strictly, according to the regulations, we would have to calculate the average weekly earnings as if that pay increase had gone through on the first day of the relevant period. There is a shortcut. So rather than having to recalculate your average weekly earnings from scratch again, if the pay increase is a percentage, then you can calculate the percentage of the SMP payment. So that first 6 weeks, the earnings related rate, the difference between the two rates will be the difference between the old and new average weekly earnings, and 90% of that. So percentage rates are quite simple to do, because you calculate, say it's 5%. That's great. Sorry, say it's 2%. You would calculate 2% of the SMP earnings related rate, and then pay a lump sum to the employee of that difference times the number of weeks they were on that earnings related rate. So most employees, it'd be 6 weeks. Some employees that stayed on it for longer, you may have more backdated SMP to pay them. It is an SMP payment, so you can reclaim 92% of it if you put it through your payroll correctly, and it must be paid at the point where the pay increase goes through. You mustn't wait until the employee's back on maternity leave to do it. So yeah, that's Alabaster for you in a nutshell. I don't know if, Matt, you can see them now?
Unfortunately not, but
okay.
I'll have to let you carry on. Just a point on Alabaster, one question that we always get asked, and I know this is a maternity webinar, statutory maternity pay, but it does only apply to maternity leave. It does not apply to things like paternity or shared parental leave. That's a common question that we sometimes get asked.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's worth just mentioning, you do have to recalculate things like shared parental leave, adoption, the neonatal, sorry, is the new one. It's a Friday afternoon. If the pay increase would affect that relevant period. So if it's, say, a backdated pay increase, yes, you would have to recalculate average weekly earnings, but it's only maternity and adoption, actually, where you need to recalculate for the whole period. Okay, my next question from Navina, sorry for pronouncing that incorrectly. If an employee is on maternity leave and they become pregnant again with qualifying period while they're paid SMP, which rate would we use to calculate average weekly earnings? And the answer is the gross NIable pay. So even though it had been reduced for the maternity, they're only receiving SMP, that's now their NIable pay during that relevant period. So you would use that to calculate whether they qualify for maternity leave the next time. Yes, I know it happens. So that's that. Alyssa asked about how it differs for payroll on a 4 weekly payment. You apply the same principles. I'm assuming you're talking about the relevant period for calculating average weekly earnings. Same principles apply. You identify date 1, date 2, and any pay days that fall in between that. The difference is with a 4 weekly payroll, you'll either have 2 that fall into that period or 3. And you'd either divide by 8 weeks if it's 2 pay days, or 12 weeks if it's 3 pay days. So you take into account the periods that those pay covers. We've got enough time for it.
Yeah, a couple more.
Yeah, great. So I'll go for Lindsay, who asked, when calculating employer's pension to pay for a variable pay worker, should this be based on the average weekly earnings? And that is a great question. So the law around pensions, it's rooted in the Equalities Act, I think, is that employers must continue to pay the same amount of employers' pension contributions for any paid period of maternity leave. So if your employee has variable pay beforehand, my understanding is that you should use a reasonable reference period to calculate what that employer's contribution should be. Average weekly earnings seems like a good way to do that, but there isn't a prescribed method of calculating what that employer pension contribution should be, just that it shouldn't change during that period of leave.
While you're talking about pensions, then something that came up, I think, in an earlier webinar, do you want to explore what you do with salary sacrifice arrangements? Not necessarily has to be pensions, but salary sacrifice arrangements and maternity leave are another common question that we get.
Yeah, it absolutely always is a minefield. So the thing to understand about salary sacrifice arrangements is that they're not a deduction from pay. So when a person enters into a salary sacrifice arrangement, they agree to reduce their pay in exchange for another benefit. So that other benefit could be childcare vouchers, could be pension contributions, whatever it happens to be. And so when we look at SMP, that will affect two big things. It's going to affect the average weekly earnings that we calculate for that employee, because their NI-able pay is reduced, because their new pay is their post-sacrifice pay. So average weekly earnings will be calculated on post-sacrifice pay. The other thing that it affects is those rights, as I just mentioned, during maternity leave, where things like employer pension contributions or any non-cash benefits, company cars, I don't know, medical insurance, have to be retained during the period of maternity leave. So that means that if you have a salary sacrifice pension, the employee's pay is reduced, so their average weekly earnings is based on that, but it means the employer pension contributions, which I previously said have to remain the same, include that element that has been sacrificed, because that is now an employer pension contribution. So that full amount, including the employee's part, has to stay exactly the same during any period of paid maternity leave. And with some salary sacrifice arrangements, you also have to be careful of the unpaid period of maternity leave, depending on how the contract has been worded. So it is definitely something to be conscious of with maternity leave. The last thing that I'll mention on salary sacrifice, because I get up on my soapbox about it, is that because it's not a deduction from pay, you can't take a salary sacrifice deduction from SMP. SMP is the minimum amount that you must pay to your employees during that period. It's calculated on their average weekly earnings. That's it. You can't take a salary sacrifice deduction from it. You can take optional voluntary deductions that are taken from net earnings. So if they're in a sports and social club and they want to continue being in the sports and social club during maternity leave, you can take a deduction for that from the maternity pay. Hope that was okay and not too roundabout.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Great. What have we got? I'll do another couple. So again, if you really want a question answered, now is your moment to upvote them, please. I will answer Marcella's question next, which is, if an employee gets a pay rise after the qualifying week and the employer enhances the maternity pay to full pay, should we recalculate the average weekly earnings to claim the new amount for SMP from HMRC? What a great question. Yeah. So this is not a grey area. Again, it depends on how the wordings of the contract. But sometimes if you've paid occupational pay, that can offset that alabaster amount because you've already paid it. It's only the alabaster amount that would be considered as SMP. I think I would probably hesitate to give you a blanket ruling on this. I would probably seek specialist advice if you want to reclaim the 92% of the alabaster payment because you've paid occupational maternity pay. I wouldn't want to advise that blanket, but I do know that occupational pay can be used to offset having to make a payment in the first place.
Yeah, fantastic. I think Caprice sent me a couple through. I think a good question, I don't know if you can see it there, from Victoria. The employee, they've got an employee who's got an annual contract that ends on the 31st of the 8th, 2025, but they were notified in July that she is pregnant. Can we terminate the employee and continue to pay SMP because they were entitled?
Aha, okay. So first of all, let me just state that you absolutely cannot terminate because the employee is pregnant. That's not
rule
on the
number
board. Yeah, rule number one, be very careful of that. If it is, say, a fixed term contract that was due to come to an end or redundancy situation, again, I'm not an employment law expert, so tread carefully here. But if the employment comes to an end after that qualifying week, you're absolutely right that the employee still qualifies for maternity leave for the full 39 weeks from their employer. You have the option to retain the employee on the payroll and just terminate the contract. So they wouldn't continue to accrue, say, holiday pay or other employment related issues, but you just retain them on the payroll to pay them each month. as you would on a normal pay frequency, and then P45 at the end, or you can pay the required amount of SMP in advance as a lump sum payment. If you do, there are some considerations there. So think about NI amounts will be higher, both employee and employer, because you're paying it in one pay period instead of spread out. It may affect tax if it is sort of at the end of the tax year rather than the earnings going into the next tax year. And the last thing is that your employee can't begin work with another employer during that period where you've paid them for SMP, because if they do, then you weren't able to pay them an SMP amount for that week where they started work, and therefore you would have overclaimed your 92% from HMRC. So those are things to be cautious about. But yeah, you can do it.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I think we'll wrap it up there. I just want to say to everyone, thank you for attending today. You will get a copy of the slides, and the recording will be sent out at the end of the week. Thank you very much for being part of the National Payroll Week celebrations. Don't forget to tag us on any of your social media posts, and I hope you've enjoyed all the other sessions we've had throughout the week. What a way to wrap it up, Fiona. Thank you very much.
There we go. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much. And hopefully we will come and be a member. If you're not already a member, it's well worth doing. Take care.
Thank you very much. Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.